interesting what environmental conditions lead people to break the behavior. And it isn't necessarily the people who are most adversely affected by the lockdown who are the most neglectful of the rules.
Absolutely.
Quite often rich people who, to be honest, can often sit that one out with a fairly minimal degree of discomfort, are the people who break the rules, which seems particularly ridiculous. If there are people in small apartments who are following the rules, then for someone with a large garden to break the rules, I think is particularly repellent. Because you have a double duty with the rules, by the way. You have a duty to obey the rules so as to minimize the risk of infection. But there's also, of course, the contagion, the visible contagion, that if a lot of people break the rules, other people will start to break the rules.
Absolutely.
So you have a duty, in a sense, not to drive about, go on pointlessly long cycling trips, etc., just to preserve the impression when people walk out of their building that to be walking about is an unusual action, not a social norm. It's rather like smoking. The best argument for banning smoking is that the presence of smokers normalizes smokers. The secondhand smoke argument is actually scientifically quite flimsy, if one's to be absolutely rigorous about the science. Where the argument is very, very potent is in the argument of social contagion, which is even when you correct for the likelihood of smokers to hang out with other smokers, the use of tobacco in one extra person in a group of 5 friends has a very significant upward effect on whether someone else in that group takes up smoking or reverts to smoking, or more likely has a failed quit attempt. Much, much harder to quit if 2 of your friends are still at it. And so that's really the better argument. It's very interesting because we legislate very much on the basis of independent free will.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we can only exercise free will to a constrained extent. But what has been interesting about this whole thing is by making the world's population, by turning them into amateur virologists, people have at least ended up with a slightly better grasp of complexity and complex systems. Because, we spend a lot of our lives kind of pretending that everything's kind of linear and straightforward.
Uh-huh.
And what this does is it helps us realize there's quite a lot in life which is a bit like the 3-body problem. It doesn't submit to easy mathematics except at a very generalized level.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the interesting things about that is one of the things in my book is don't try and solve for the average.
Absolutely.
Because if you try and solve for the average, the only solutions that are available to you are universal solutions. So you've got the rules in the front of the book. And my example I gave in the book, because we hadn't had coronavirus yet when I wrote it, was if you try and solve train overcrowding by looking at everybody who has to stand on a train, the solution is more trains, more frequent trains, faster trains, longer trains, or cramming more seats onto trains. Expensive solutions.
That would be the logical.
But if you actually look at it in a more new way, totally logical thing to do. We have overcrowding. The data tells us that a large percentage of people are standing. Maybe you say a large percentage of people are standing between these 2 times. Okay, therefore we need this amount of extra capacity. And my argument was you're failing to make a distinction there, which is also a distinction which matters in virology. Okay, do you meet 10 people once, or do you meet 1 person 10 times? Because the effect in transmission terms is not the same. Do you meet 1 person for an hour, or do you meet 10 people for 6 minutes? Again, they're not the same. And so my argument was, look, 100 people who have to stand on a train 10% of the time don't matter. But 10 people who have to stand on a train 100% of the time do matter. Because the 10 people are season ticket holders who pay you a lot of money and you're effectively never giving them a seat. The other people are merely unlucky. If 10% of their train journeys essentially end up with them standing, that's probably my experience of using the London Underground. And I just file that on the shit happens tray. It doesn't lead me to have a huge sense of grievance against the London Underground. I just go, yeah, sometimes sometimes there are more people than usual, and sometimes you don't get a seat. That's kind of the rules of the game.
Yeah.
Now, what you could do very simply is you could have 2 trains a day or 3 trains a day in each direction and say, these trains are exclusively for the use of season ticket holders, and you mark them on as such on the timetable. Now, if that means that the worst affected people suddenly get a seat 60% of the time or 70% of the time, they won't always be able to travel on those trains, and sometimes you'll have to stand on those trains. But if you actually engage in what I call microsurgery, rather than wholesale, wholesale chopping out of the organ, instead you can engage in some sort of keyhole surgery. You can solve the greater part of the problem by intervening at a much less expensive and much more minimal level.